that somebody had asked him very innocuously, where were you the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated? And they expected he would tell them some heartwarming or some touching or at least interesting story. And instead he said, gosh, where was I? Gee, I just can't remember. And I thought, well, that has to be the strangest darn thing. In fact, let me ask you, anybody here who was 5 years old or over November 22, 1963, how many of you do not remember where you were that day? Note for the record, not a hand has gone up. So, see, he either has a really, really bad memory or there's something else going on. Now, I was fascinated by that, and so during the 5 years I researched Family of Secrets, I ran multiple research tracks, and one of them that I spent a full 5 years on was trying to answer this thing. Why could he not remember where he was, and where was he? Well, the answer to that is contained in 4 chapters in Family of Secrets. It may be the most explosive material in the book. They're all facts, they're all documented. You can do what you will with them. I'll just give you a few of them just to sort of whet your appetite. On November 22, 1963, Poppy Bush, the man who later could not remember where he was, there is a declassified FBI memo from J. Edgar Hoover, and it references the Kennedy assassination, and it talks about a briefing on November 23 dealing with the assassination and Cuban exiles. Excuse me. And in this memo, it says that they were liaising with representatives of 2 other intelligence agencies, the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA, and it names both of those people. The representative of the CIA related to the Kennedy assassination was George Bush. That's the name in there. Now, some years later, when that document first surfaced, Bush denied that that was him. The CIA would not comment because they never comment about personnel. But this document first emerged when Bush was about to be crowned the Republican nominee for president, and so you would think that might be slightly interesting. So the CIA, apparently pressured by Bush, released a statement saying, oh, no, that wasn't him, that was another George Bush, and they identified this fellow, and they said, but we don't know where he is, we can't find him. Well, that tells you something about how competent the agency is, because a journalist who lives right here in town, I'm trying to think, was it Okoka? There were 2 different journalists from San Francisco, interestingly, who were the only people who followed up on this memo and another memo I'm about to tell you about, a guy named Joe McBride, I don't know, maybe Joe's here, and a fellow named Miguel Okoka. So when they contacted this fellow, he said, that wasn't me. And in fact, the story of the other George Bush in itself is so fascinating. This is this world of mirrors that we don't really see. We all rush out to buy the pot boilers and the made-up stories, but the real stuff is absolutely as good or better. This George Bush was this fellow who wasn't even in government, and he was recruited by the CIA in 1963, put into a low-level training position. He said he never had any briefings on anything. He worked there for a few months, until shortly after the assassination, and they got rid of him. So he was only employed by them exactly in this period where the other George Bush could not remember where he was. In any case, so that memo is one memo. The same guy couldn't remember where he was. According to this, he was a CIA agent having something to do with Cuban exiles and information about the Kennedy assassination. There's another memo that has come to light, and this one is relating to actually November 22 itself. On 1:45 p.m., according to this FBI memo, a phone call was received at the FBI's office in Houston, strangely enough, not in Dallas, where the shooting took place. The man who called identified himself as George H.W. Bush, this time with his initials, and he gave his home address, and he said, I'm from Zapata Offshore, which was his company, and he said, I'm calling with possible information on who shot President Kennedy. Okay, now this is the same person who years later was president of the United States and couldn't remember where he was. So now we've got him not remembering where he was. We have him working for the CIA in one memo, and in the other one we have him being a private citizen and an oilman calling a different FBI office to say, I'd like to offer a tip. He identifies a fellow. He says, I've heard that he may have been threatening the president. I really don't know much about this man, but good luck with that. By the way, I'm calling from Tyler, Texas. It's 1:45 p.m. Put that in your records. So I started studying what it meant to be in Tyler, Texas at 1:45 p.m. when the shooting was at 12:30 and so forth. I later found in a Barbara Bush. Now we all know Barbara Bush is a very sweet lady and would never do anything bad. But Barbara Bush in I want to say 93, 94, right after they'd left the White House, she published her memoirs. And in her memoirs, she suddenly remembers for Poppy where they were on November 22. She puts in a purported letter that she had been writing that day to her family, where she's under a hairdryer in Tyler, Texas, and she hears the horrible news that the president has been shot. I study that letter, and I suggest in Family of Secrets that that may not be a real letter, because she addresses it "Dear Family," and we tried to figure it out. There didn't seem to be anybody who that could have been addressed to. It was not written to her children. She was estranged from her own family. We could not figure who that was. And in that letter, she drops little hints of things, but she misspells all of the names. So I think what's going on here is that if somebody like me should ever come along and start putting the pieces together, and we say, hey, what about this? They could say, hey, we were open about it. I said I had lunch with Doris Ulmer. But what she doesn't say is, who's Doris Ulmer? Now, I went and I studied, and I found all the Doris Ulmers in America, and I figured out who it was. Her husband, and it says, "Dear family, I had lunch with Doris Ulmer." You may remember that her husband was so kind to George when he was in Greece. So I thought, well, when was he in Greece? And what was he doing in Greece? And how did he know this man? So I tried to figure out who her husband was. His name was Al Ulmer, and he was one of the CIA station chiefs in charge of removing leaders of countries. And he was living abroad, but he just happened to visit the Dallas area that week. Okay. Anyway, I've got, as I say, 4 chapters. This isn't time to go through all that, but I hope you find that interesting. I tried to write Family of Secrets in a way where I just lay out these facts. They're all documented. They're really indisputable. By the way, if you've been online, you've seen some of the reviews. I've been attacked for providing these facts. Los Angeles Times said that anybody who even questions the official Lee Harvey Oswald story, what did the term he use? You have to question their state of mental health, I believe he said. This despite the fact that the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s actually concluded in their report the high probability that there was a conspiracy. This is Congress concluding that. They just couldn't figure out who did it. So there's that. And then we go forward to the next interesting period, which is the removal of Richard Nixon. Now, growing up, I always thought Richard Nixon was a bad guy, and that was the end of the story. And I remember the heroes were Woodward and Bernstein and Nixon and Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Mitchell. These were the bad guys. And then there were the semi-good guys like John Dean and so on who testified against him. But you see, what I started thinking about was, wait a minute, Poppy Bush, I already know that he was in these intelligence operations years before. He must have still been in them in 1973 at the height of Watergate. And what was his job then? Does anybody remember?
Who are you talking about?
Poppy Bush.
I think he got in the CIA right before Kennedy got killed, and he got out right after.
No. In 1973, Nixon appointed him to head up the Republican Party. So he was basically the head of the Republican Party when Nixon was being taken down. So I thought, well, I'd just check and see what he did during that period. And I went to the books. I went to all the books by all your favorite best historians about that period, about Nixon, about Watergate, the books about Bush and by Bush, and there was almost nothing in there. And I thought, man, this guy is the anti-Zelig. You know, he's supposed to be in the picture, but he never is. So I thought, this is really, really weird. And then I remembered remember during Iran-Contra, he was vice president, but he claimed he was out of the loop. He somehow missed all those meetings with Ollie North and everything, didn't know anything about it.